Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this FedSoc Forum webinar discussing what will become of BEAD, otherwise known as the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. My name is Libby Dickinson, and I am an Assistant Director with the Federalist Society's practice groups. As a reminder, all opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not of the Federalist Society. In the interest of time, I'll introduce today's moderator, who will then introduce our impressive panel of legal scholars. But if you'd like to know more about any of our speakers today, you can access their full bios at fedsoc.org. That is fedsoc.org. To that point, our moderator today is Slate Herman, Legislative Counsel at Wilkinson Barker Knauer, and who previously served as counsel for the House Energy and Commerce Committee, representing the interests of Chairwoman Kathy McMorris Rogers on the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, where he oversaw wireline and satellite communication policy and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Prior to Capitol Hill, Slate worked as an attorney advisor in the NTIA's Office of the Chief Counsel. One last note throughout the panel, if you have any questions for our speakers that pertain to the topic at hand, please submit them through Zoom's Q&A feature, not the chat, so that we'll be able to access them when we get towards the close of our webinar. And with that, I will hand things over to our moderator to start things off. Slate, thank you so much for joining us today and for moderating this excellent panel.
Thanks, Libby. I appreciate it. Well, I'm excited for today's discussion of the BEAD program. I think I want to start by just welcoming all of our online folks and our panelists here today. Once again, if you want to ask questions, I'm looking out for those, so please do pop them in the Q&A section as we go throughout the panel. So let's start by introducing our panelists. First, we have Mr. Joe Kane. Joe Kane is the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, otherwise known as ITIF. His research includes how to identify and address the causes of the digital divide. He holds a master's degree in economics from George Mason University and a JD from the Catholic University of America. Next, we have Commissioner Mike O'Reilly. Commissioner Mike O'Reilly is a visiting fellow from the Hudson Institute's Center for the Economics of the Internet. Commissioner O'Reilly was nominated for the seat on the Federal Communications Commission by President Barack Obama on August 1st, 2013, was confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate on October 29th, 2013, and he served as a commissioner until December 11th, 2020. Prior to joining the agency, Commissioner O'Reilly served as a policy advisor in the office of the Senate Republican Whip, led by U.S. Senator John Cornyn. He also worked in the Republican Whip's office as an advisor, Deputy Chief of Staff, and Policy Director for U.S. Senator John Kyle. He also previously worked for the Republican Policy Committee in the U.S. Senate as a policy analyst for banking, technology, transportation, trade, and commerce issues. Thanks for joining us, Commissioner O'Reilly and Mr. Kane. And next we have Ms. Nat Purser. Nat is a policy advocate at Public Knowledge, focusing on broadband affordability and access issues. Prior to joining Public Knowledge, Nat was at the Center for Economic and Policy Research as a fellow on Capitol Hill, where she performed legislative research for the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She previously worked on competition and content moderation at Yelp and in the state legislature. Welcome, Nat. Next, we have Stephanie Weiner, and Stephanie Weiner is a senior research fellow at Georgetown Law's Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. Prior to her fellowship, she served as chief counsel at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and also as my boss, where she led the legal team's implementing of the historic federal investments to expand broadband internet access and to foster wireless supply chain innovation. Stephanie also previously served as a senior legal advisor to a former FCC chairman and a former U.S. Department of Energy general counsel. Welcome, Stephanie Weiner. Awesome. So let's get started. First question, I think kind of the format we'll follow is I'll ask a question and I'll point to a panelist, and then we'll kind of let the conversation flow from there as you feel you want to chime in. If there's a questions you don't have to chime into, I don't think we need to all talk in every single one, well, because we'll only get through one or two questions, but as you feel you need to chime in, please do. For those of us who have no idea what BEAD is or what it stands for, or what the NTIA is, or how we got here, Commissioner O'Reilly, would you mind just bringing us up to speed and kind of laying the foundation for the discussion that we will have here today?
Okay, I'll help set the table, and then my fellow panelists can fill in if I make some mistakes or need to add addition. So BEAD is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. It is a federal subsidy mechanism created by Congress as part of the Biden Infrastructure Act. I think it was 2021. It is intended to provide federal subsidy dollars of over $40 billion in a block grant-like structure where funding would go to the states, and the states would then allocate it to broadband providers to build broadband networks to those American households, locations that don't have service today, the unserved population, and in some cases, the underserved population. There's a couple more tiers to that too as well, but that's the population that's going to get most of the funding. And NTIA, for people who are unfamiliar, and many of you work there, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration is an office or an agency within Department of Commerce. It is charged with being the executive branch voice on communications policy and has responsibility under that for a number of functions, whereas the FCC is an independent regulatory body, and I'll avoid any conversation on what is independence these days, but it sits over outside of the executive branch in some degree. And NTIA is fully within the executive branch, and it is charged by the Infrastructure Act with overseeing and implementing the BEAD program. How we got to where we are today, I think there were a number of criticism laid at the Biden NTIA over its implementation of BEAD. And the Trump administration came in and decided to make a number of changes to the program. And I think that's what we're going to follow through and have a conversation about.
Anyone else want to add some sprinkles on top of that?
I can't help myself. First of all, having recently served at NTIA with Slate, I wanted to just jump in and mention the breadth of what NTIA does, because it was something that really surprised me. And so while this conversation is focused on the broadband connectivity programs, NTIA is the president's advisor on telecommunications information policy, manages federal spectrum, internet governance, all of those things. Also, I should have said thank you to Slade for including me on the panel and to the Federalist Society for having us. On BEAD specifically, I did want to mention two things about kind of where it came from to begin with. And obviously you mentioned, Commissioner, 2021, right? We were really in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I do think that's part of the history here. In addition to the other infrastructure programs, I think that really was part of what allowed a lot of folks to come together to support at least, some kind of infrastructure when it came to broadband. And the second point would be, I think that happened against the history of a lot of attempts to try to connect the hardest to reach areas and communities in the country, right? And none had yet gotten the job done. And I think that was kind of a baseline for what BEAD in its original incarnation in the last administration and in this administration. I think there's still that context is important about trying to get the job done here and connect those who have been, in areas that it hasn't been economic to serve or haven't had the kind of connectivity that other parts of the country have had. Something that I know last time, we haven't seen each other recently, but we worked really closely at times on universal service policy when I was at the commission, and it's something I know you have thought about for a long time. So I just wanted to add that as additional context to kind of the background before we jump into what's happened here.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Let's jump in time. So on June 6, 2025, the NTIA released the BEAD restructuring policy notice. I don't necessarily need a full summary, but I think if we went around, Joe, if you wouldn't mind starting for us, and kind of just touch on the biggest changes that you think are in the policy notice, I think it'll kind of help us paint a decent picture that we can build our discussion on top of.
Sure. Yeah, I'll highlight three things. I'm sure others will have more. I think two good things and one bad/incomplete thing, I think. One is, I'm sure we'll have a bigger discussion about tech neutrality, but I think one of the biggest good changes was to redefine the priority broadband tier to be not just fiber, essentially, to define reliable broadband based on the performance it provides, not based on the technology that provides it. I think that's going to be really important to the program actually meeting the goal of closing the digital divide. Then another change is having this sort of rerunning this bidding round, what the guidance calls the benefit of the bargain round, where states have to score for the first time, or in some cases rescore ISP's bids according to the new rules that are in the guidance. And then the primary criteria in that round is now going to be what is the lowest cost. So the lowest cost to the program. And then there's secondary criteria. If you're within 15% of the lowest bid, then you can account for other things as well. But I think that also sort of getting down the deployment cost is going to be really important to closing the digital divide. I think the most important thing to understand about sort of the digital divide right now is that it's not a deployment problem. And so the more money we spend on deployment, the less money we have for the bigger causes of the digital divide. So yeah, it's 3% of the digital divide right now is a lack of deployment. We have the vast majority of it is things like affordability, things like lack of interest or digital skills, that kind of thing. But that kind of goes to the thing that I think is maybe not as good, or at least incomplete, about the new guidance, is that it pulled back all the non-deployment uses of BEAD funds and says, this is pending. We're going to give you more guidance about this later, but we haven't seen what that is yet. And that's, having states. The whole point, I think, of saving money on deployment funds is in order to use that money for these bigger causes of the digital divide. To say we have low-income folks in our state, and we can have a targeted low-income program that will allow people to have affordable broadband where they didn't before. That's something that goes a lot further towards closing the digital divide than does deploying more and more fiber. And so I think getting that non-deployment guidance out there, and especially using it to enable things like digital skills training and for targeted affordability programs, is going to be really important to how we actually end up looking back on BEAD.
Awesome. Does anyone else want to hop in?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and contribute something as well. Yeah, I think building off of what Joe said there about like the tech neutrality shift, that was like one very important update. It does still give the states, the right to adhere to the IIJ, mandates around like sort of constructing what they view to be a priority broadband project. But I think one other thing to note about the update is that it does inject some unpredictability or variability into the process by including lines like, the NTIA reserves the right to reject an eligible entity's selection of a project if it imposes unreasonable costs or something like that, like having various like veto points in the process. I think that this does create some uncertainty for states about what amounts to an unreasonable cost, or how hard they can go on investments in more expensive technologies like fiber. So I think the ambiguity in some ways is good and allows for some creativity from state broadband offices. It allows more technologies to be in the mix, but it can also be a little bit confusing for states to parse.
I would think that, I would argue that this is just a reversion to the statute by, eliminating the policy decisions that were extraterritorial or that didn't belong, by solving the rate regulation piece and saying we're going to remove some uncertainty there, by answering the technological neutrality issue. It reverts to what the statute, and by no means is the statute sacrosanct. I testified in the House and the Senate that this maybe not be the best approach to go. So we start with a somewhat of a shaky foundation in a block grant structure, and then we added a lot of things on top of. And I think what the Trump administration is doing is correcting and steering back to what the statute says, and I think that's helpful for the overall program.
When I talk about variability, I think I'm speaking to things like waivers and how those are administered, and then also, the fact that the NTIA can veto projects that it deems without having a set standard in place around what poses an unreasonable cost. I do think that creates a little bit of ambiguity, but yeah, point taken on other things hewing maybe more closely to the statute.
Now, I kind of want to follow up on that with you a little bit. One of the first sections of the policy notice, and one of the primary stated reasons for the restructuring itself, is this idea of the elimination of regulatory burdens, things like labor, employment requirements, workforce requirements, open access requirements, and kind of the non-traditional broadband providers provisions. Do you think these eliminations will have their intended effect of speeding up deployment, or do you believe that the changing of the rules in the middle of the program causes more trouble than it's worth?
So we all know that elections have consequences, and it's totally within the administration's purview to modify the program to meet its, technological or ideological imperatives. But I don't think that the changes are going to speed things up. So, I mean, the program was just about to get shovels in the ground after a long time, but like in January, February, it was ready to go, at least in a couple states, and a lot of other states were at like the 5-yard line. They're being subjected to another bidding round. This is not going to slow things down for the vast majority of states. And I think I want to be clear about why BEAD hasn't fully gotten off the ground. I think that the labor and the open access provisions play a very minimal role in why it has taken so long to get to the point that we're currently at. I mean, a lot of the real delays came from the statutory design of the program, which, as Stephanie sort of alluded to before, was in reaction to RDOF. Like in great part, as you'll recall, RDOF, about a third of those funds went into default. It was based off of kind of shoddy maps. So BEAD had to fix that and move in response to that. And that involved setting up state broadband offices, oftentimes from scratch. And look, if I could sick the abundance guys on any actual like red tape fixing, it would be the federal hiring process, because I've heard so much about how like getting these offices stood up was a really difficult challenge. Then you had to actually like do the mapping process, do the challenge process. And meanwhile, there was broadband money that was flowing through other sources like the Capital Projects Fund and the Tribal Connectivity Program. So it wasn't like we were totally idle on other fronts. But I think, if the goal here is speed, this restructuring is not going to deliver speed necessarily. It's probably going to add another year to the program. And I guess my big question here is like, for what? Maybe you're going to get some cost savings from the cheaper technologies, and that's like great. But if we're going to cut costs, then maybe the leftover funds should actually go towards connectivity advances in other areas like affordability or adoption initiatives. I mean, speaking to what Joe was talking about earlier, I don't necessarily think all this money going back to Treasury is the best use of our time and resources. States were promised the funds. I think we should, deliver on those promises.
Yeah, I would just chime in on the speed point. I think the important question there is speed to do what? And I think that there's, getting shovels in the ground is one thing, but if we're getting shovels in the ground to have exorbitantly expensive fiber projects that are, in some cases, the people who are ready to get shovels in the ground were going to be spending $77,000 per location in Nevada to run fiber lines. That's money that could have gone to like hundreds of years of affordability support for another household. And so the folks who aren't getting the affordability support are going to have to wait, I guess, an indefinite amount of time to get the broadband that they need. And so it's a program that says, let's slam on the brakes on these sort of overly expensive deployment programs and deploy in a more efficient way, opens the door for us to actually more quickly address these bigger causes of the digital divide. Not to mention that maybe we end up shifting to technologies that can deploy more quickly than fiber does.
I think the fact that a lot of states were able to do full fiber programs while staying under budget, I think shows that there are ways to use all the technologies at our disposal. Some states did a mix, some did fiber forward, but a lot of states were able to do fiber primary or fiber forward under cost. So I think the cost savings element is maybe somewhat overstated.
Well, it's just that you can say cover everyone with fiber, but if you're spending all the money on fiber and just barely staying under budget, imagine if you use a cheaper technology and then you have far more money for affordability and digital inclusion programs.
Yeah, I think if we spend the leftover money on affordability and inclusion programs, that would be great.
I just wanted to jump in to say one comment. I think the question kind of speed to do what and who makes the decisions are kind of the like background questions here, I think. And by who, I mean, where is NTIA weighing in, where are the states weighing in? Because I think that's really something that however you want to implement this statute and hew to it as closely as possible, like there's some tension there, I think, in terms of where there's flexibility in the states and where there is kind of direction from NTIA. And so that's in the who part. And the what part, I think, is a really good question, right? Like, what do we want to have at the end of this program? And I know there may be a question about that later on in the webinar, but, at the end of the day, right, what do we want to have, bought for this bargain, right? What do we want to have accomplished? And importantly to me, how can we ensure that it actually happens, right? One of the things that hasn't changed is the importance of ensuring that whatever performance we're paying for actually comes to pass, and whether it's an affordability program or an infrastructure program, that the money is actually used for its intended purposes. And I think throughout both programs, I just wanted to bring us together for a minute. I think it's critical that there be, and the statute requires us, and so this isn't going to change. There have to be provisions in these agreements to make sure that non-performance is addressed and that there are consequences for it. And that's not just because of the RDOF history, but because we want this money to go for good purposes. And so I just wanted to get that into the conversation, because it's not something that we've done a great job at historically. And so I want to really trying to emphasize that when I'm talking about this program, and whatever you think the policy goals are, let's make sure we actually achieve them, and that there are consequences if we don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was great possibility for theft and a lot of this money going down the rat hole, and I testified to that fact. Like, just giving money to states and saying good luck was, really going to be problematic. And NTA, to its credit, was trying to put some guardrails to prevent the money from going in a bad direction. But that too has some problems. And the foundation of your question was about these extracurricular regulations that the NTIA tried to put onto broadband providers that now no one wants to defend. The policy, the Trump administration has wiped them away and said none of these need to be complied with, and we can reduce compliance costs, we can reduce the risk for providers, and they have these are policy calls that even the former administrator of BEAD was like, yeah, we don't really need those. I mean, that to me was is indicative of a problem with the program. And so I think that that is fixing this administration is fixing something that was in need of fixing. In terms of extra money, if there are going to be places that we probably aren't going to have enough money. There were a number of states, certainly when fiber was the preference, that were going to say, hey, I'm going to be broke. 15, 16 states are already saying they're going to be they didn't have enough money, and we're probably going to be in the same boat as this go around. Maybe not as high, because we're allowing more technologies to be part of the equation, but somewhere there's going to be a shortage of funding. And so the second part, in terms of what do we do if there is extra funds, we have two things. One is the nation happens to be $37 trillion in debt. And so we don't need to just spend it because we have it. And two is there's going to be needed elsewhere. And so if we don't spend it in Connecticut or Delaware, that's probably a good thing. If the number of households are really shrunk over the time because of a number of different factors, then we should celebrate that and not overspend for the heck of it.
I think the next question kind of gets to that a little bit. Stephanie, this one, you'll start us off on this one. One of the more controversial sections of the original BEAD NOFO were the affordability provisions, the middle class affordability plan and the low cost service option. These provisions were cut by the restructuring policy notice. And kind of what do you think the effect of these cuts will be on the broader BEAD program and its implementation?
Yeah, no, I'm glad to address this question. Although to begin with, I want to just point out that, the low-cost service option was and is a statutory requirement, not a NOFO requirement. And so while NTIA's notice definitely changed the approach for the low-cost service option, it didn't cut the requirement, because of course agencies, at least I think, can't violate or not follow through on the statute as it's written. But the policy notice did, I think, cut the middle class affordability plan, which was not a statutory requirement, but was something that was specific to the NOFO. And the NOFO, the notice NTA did as I mentioned, provide that the low-cost service option approach, where states were setting out in their initial proposals a low-cost service option that was a requirement, the notice said that that requirement was no longer applicable, and instead it put the burden on the providers to comply with the statute by identifying and submitting to the state a low-cost service option along with their proposal, and then that low-cost service option, which is I should say for people who don't know what I'm talking about, just in case, is a service offering that is intended for what are defined as eligible subscribers who are, among other things, low-income consumers. And then that, gets included in the final proposal. I think, your question was about what are the effects of this, and I think we don't quite know yet because, as I said, it's still a requirement. It kind of shifted how it happened. We won't know. We'll see all the low-cost service options because actually by statute, the assistant secretary is required to make them public upon approval. And we'll see them likely when they go out for comment, which the final proposals go out for comment. So I think we'll have a better sense in not too long, given the timeline. That said, look, I come from a perspective where I think that kind of this shift does at least potentially put at risk the extent to which the program can help close the affordability and adoption gaps, which, significant aspects of the digital divide, which Joe mentioned, understanding that there may be difference of opinion as to how you address those gaps. This was one way that, Congress was attempting to address them. And I think it's, there are concerns with the shift that, put simply, right, we're going to have these BEAD-funded, taxpayer-funded networks, and if households can't afford the service, they won't be able to take advantage of it. And now you've, yes, built a deployment to this location, but if no one can take advantage of the service, the full benefit here that was intended is not getting accomplished. And always one other point, which I've been thinking about, by definition, these locations are locations without other service being provided, or certainly the unserved areas, right? And so that means that, typically there's at least some market competition that helps to discipline pricing. And so here, you're just not going to have that. And so I'm not saying one way or the other what that will do to cost, but there's just one less control from the marketplace on the BEAD-funded providers, reasonable cost to everybody, not just low-income subscribers. So, those are the concerns, I think, but we won't know. None of the concerns are new, by the way. My guess is they're part of the reason why the provision was put in place by Congress to begin with, right? Like, these are things that, I think have been there and are there, and that's why, it's in the statute. And so we'll see. I think we will see different providers taking different approaches. And so there will be more variability, which, may mean that a consumer who has one BEAD-funded provider who's a low-income customer may not be able to afford a service that another would be able to afford just because of where they live. There may be effects like that, but we don't really know the full impact of this shift yet. But I'm happy to other folks, this is obviously a topic that I think people have strong opinions on. Again, it's a mechanism to address affordability. It's not the only one, and I know it's somewhat of a one that inspires strong views, or can be one that inspires strong views.
Sure, I'll share a strong view. I mean, I think I agree. The low cost. It's important that the low cost option is in the statute. It wasn't created by NTIA, and I think that makes it a little bit different from the middle class affordability plan. I think affordability is an attribute of the household and not of its income. And I think that's one of the reasons why at ITIF we have not really considered it rate regulation to say that there needs to be a low cost option. But yeah, the way you go about it is I guess, the issue. Because it's not really about the price of the broadband in isolation. It's about the price of the broadband relative to your household income. And that is not just an issue in BEAD areas. Like, there are people in unserved areas who have very high incomes and people who have low incomes. And there are people who live in urban areas where broadband is great and has been great for a long time who still can't afford it because their incomes are just too low. And so that's why I think it's sort of misdirected to try to bake that into new deployments rather than say, we should have something of a voucher program that targets the people who really need help and then give them the voucher to say, look, ISPs, if you can convince this person that your service is worth their voucher, then they'll give it to you.
Yeah, although, that issue of the household's ability to afford is kind of addressed by the eligibility criteria, right? It's not simply the fact that like the household's income, there are other criteria. And in fact, I wanted to point out one of the lesser talked about changes of this policy notice was to shift from eligibility criteria to the Lifeline program as opposed to the Affordable Connectivity Program, which whatever people think about, I will suggest is going to be easier, simpler for consumers and simpler for the agencies, right? The more that these programs align, that things like verification will be easier. But to your point, Joe, a voucher, an ACP, I think we may agree on that, but that's not something that can be done as a condition of a funding program. Certainly it's not in the statute, but also.
Sure. Well, but it is something that could be done with leftover funds if we have
yes,
spend as little as possible on deployment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason to bake it into the USF is so that it is an ongoing thing and we don't have to worry about frequent plus ups, I mean, the leftover funds are great, but it's like a one-time like injection of support. Ideally, I mean, what we would like to see is a modernized USF that includes an enhanced Lifeline program that looks a lot more like the ACP and learns like from the lessons of ACP. It is, more substantive, like something along the lines of 30/75 instead of like a paltry $9.95 a month subsidy. It's tiered for urban versus high cost and tribal areas. Ideally, it's indexed to inflation, so it doesn't become Lifeline, regular Lifeline 2.0, and it's just like outdated and outmoded after a couple of years. So yeah, we at Public Knowledge are very interested and active on the USF reform front as a way of, dealing with the policy hole that ACP expiring presents in getting these networks operational. You can approach it from the supply side, you can approach it from the consumer side, but one way or another, you have to factor in affordability.
Yeah, and I think I think we agree largely on that, Nat, that something like a richer Lifeline program is kind of the way to go. And Slade, I know we don't want to go too deep into Universal Service Fund stuff here, but I think that Universal Service Fund has in some ways the same problem that I'm describing that BEAD has, of spending so much money on rural broadband deployment and leaving aside the actual bigger issue of affordability. And so something that takes from the high cost fund, which is the majority of USF right now, and is used for rural broadband deployment and paying the operating expenses of these rural broadband ISPs, and saying that's where we're going to shift our priorities and say affordability Lifeline is a bigger deal, and so bringing back something more like a $30 voucher or something like that is probably the better way to go for a sustainable affordability program in the future.
Yeah, I mean, Slate, to your question, I think the elimination of, in the new policy call by the Trump administration is actually going to be beneficial because it provides certainty to broadband providers that they're not going to go down these paths. And therefore we have a vision of what and broadband is one of the best discount services out there. It has actually been beneficial in terms of if you look at the amount of benefit that consumers are getting compared to costs and compared to the rest of inflation and the rest of the economy, it's actually a really good economic deal. So that's being lost in the process, and somehow that broadband providers are out there to kind of extract as much as they can from consumers is just not factual. They provide one of the best benefits that's out there. But I have the scars from supporting ACP. I supported a scaled down ACP. I certainly have deep concerns of just patching up a Lifeline and think that you have to deal that with in Congress, and the commission can't do that itself. So there are a lot of, if you want to get into USF reform, we can spend a whole another hour or 2 hours on that. But there are a lot of other issues that would go into that conversation. But on the BEAD itself, I think this is beneficial to provide certainty that the Trump administration has done, and then we can figure out what type of affordability program should look like, who should administer it, and what form it should take.
That's great. Let's move on now to net neutrality. Oh, Tech neutrality, that's right, not net neutrality, different panel. Now let's talk tech neutrality. First, kind of what is tech neutrality? How does it come into play in the BEAD program? How has it come in thus far? How has the new program known has changed it? And how has technology changed since the program was written into law even 4 years ago? Commissioner O'Reilly, if you wouldn't mind starting us off here.
Sure. I think a number of the panelists have already talked about it. I mean, it is the premise, and it's been in communication policy for a long while, that you should be allowed, the provider should be allowed to use any technology to meet the offering to consumers, as long as it meets certain benchmark obligations. And we can define what those are, but the Biden administration had a particular approach, and Joe mentioned, fiber first or fiber only approach, and certainly a heavy fiber tier. And rarely would money have gone to the second tier of fixed wireless licensed offerings. And then barely would you see something go to the alternative technology tier. And I think what you're getting from the Trump administration is we're going to be more open to different technologies. The goal is to, maybe to Stephanie's question, what is the end goal? It is connectivity. It is to bring internet service. It's not to bring, and I've used this analogy before, it's not to provide every household a Maserati. It is to provide everybody access. And how do you go about doing that? And in some cases, it means, the technology may be satellite. Some of it's going to be fixed wireless that's unlicensed. Some of it's going to be, cable providers provided great service here, but it wasn't labeled as fiber, and therefore they were had a detrimental negative perception on it. So the fiber only or fiber first provision, I think, has been changed, and we're going to see what comes back from the bids in the grand bargain.
I'll jump in because I mean, yes, clearly that's a major shift here from an interpretation of the statutory term priority broadband project as meaning fiber, essentially, to the new policy notice, which really shifts to the states, kind of defines it without reference to a particular technology, to Joe's point, and just, references performance level and the statutory language, and then moves to the states to make that determination about priority broadband project in the context of a particular project. And I will say, I agree, like the history here was very much in this direction, right, where there were performance criteria identified, and then a subsidy or grant funding provided for those that met that criteria. But one of the things that's happening here is that the move to technological neutrality in the context of also the focus on minimal BEAD outlay, I think if you put those two things together, you lose some opportunity to take, the states may, though they have the ability to define priority broadband projects, I think they may lose some ability to take different network performance into account, and different kind of consequences of different infrastructure into account. And that's, I think, just an artifact of this new approach, right? And, I know that it's not my example and I'm blanking on who did it, but, it's kind of, you kind of are, by focusing solely on cost, it's like the sticker price of that car that you're buying without looking at some of the other maintenance or other criteria that are at play. And I'm not saying that those have to be fiber, but I'm just saying it really narrows my bottom line point is it really narrows the flexibility quite a bit. Even beyond just taking fiber out of the preference, something more is going on here where, other than the 15% window, right, within that, you're allowed to trade off speed and other characteristics. But and I'm not sure exactly where that came from, but outside of that, right, like, in CAF, like when we worked on the CAF auction, there were tiers, right, of service and different points that tried to balance this different performance for different costs. And it's not an easy thing to do outside the marketplace, which otherwise does it, right? So I'm not saying that I'm not saying it's simple, I'm not saying it's one answer, but I think it's worth putting this in the context of the minimal BEAD outlay focus and thinking about kind of what are those trade-offs. It doesn't just become tech neutral. This other thing also happened, which kind of pushes towards a minimal level of service within that 15% window. Whatever you think of that, I think it's important to make both kind of think about it in that context.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things about that. I think it is sort of pushing towards that minimal level of service, but the minimal level of service in BEAD is 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload, which is far more than like your average person is using at any average household even is using at any given time. So I don't think this is sort of like, if you have any technology that is meeting that standard, that is high speed broadband that a household is getting good service with. This isn't some sort of like cut rate broadband that they're going to be left with after BEAD. The other thing I would say about the technologies is there has been a lot of change since the program was enacted. I think we looked at the number of satellites that were launched in the 3 years before IIJA was passed, which is the statute that created BEAD, and 3 years after, and it was like a 3x difference, and it's continuing to increase. A lot of that is Starlink because they were the first ones to get launched, but right now we have Kuiper, which is Amazon's low Earth orbit satellite service launching. And that's what we're going to have, all of those satellites. That's going to be many thousands of satellites up in the air. That's going to greatly increase the capacity of those technologies. Also, back when IIJA was passed, fixed wireless was kind of a new thing. That was sort of like people deciding, oh, what's 5G going to be? Like, what can we do with this? And now it's one of the fastest growing home internet technologies that exists in the country. And so I don't think it's strange to say, Congress had in mind sort of what these technologies were at the time, but now NTIA is right to look back at them and say, hey, we actually have way more broadband than we thought in a lot of ways, and way cheaper broadband than we thought, and therefore we can save a lot of money on the deployment side, and that opens up opportunities to address the bigger causes of the digital divide.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly respond on the 120 point, just because the history here, like way back when we used to have USF subsidies for 4 megabits per second, right? And then we were funded networks for 10.1. And then when I was at the commission, we were talking about 25.3, and that was we lock in these levels and these minimums in a way that I think will get superseded within the lifetime of the program, especially if we're talking about whether it's the 4-year period of performance or the 10-year period of performance. I'm excited about the new technologies. Don't get me wrong. Like, I think that they will fundamentally change connectivity. I think it's worth revisiting universal service policy in light of them. But I am nervous about kind of accepting a minimum given the history here and how quickly things change and how important it is to have connectivity to participate in this society. So I just wanted to respond to that 120 point. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut you off again. I'm gonna come right back to you, but I want to highlight something you specifically have written about, which is the One Big Beautiful Bill. Potential changes to CBRS and 6 gigahertz. And so while we talk about, deployment technologies, also kind of the underlying statutory changes. So whatever you were going to say, please say that. But if you could add a little bit on just some of those larger statutory changes as well and how they may impact BEAD deployment.
Yeah, so we know that under the revised guidance that ULFWs are allowed to kind of challenge certain locations and say like, hey, we already covered these locations, you can remove them out of BEAD eligibility because we're already existent there. That's part of like the tech neutrality approach. And from what I understand, the challenge process from ULFWs, it's like been pretty mixed. Like there are some states like I think Texas, Oklahoma, Maine. I saw a broadband breakfast report about this not too long ago that showed that they actually are not super engaged on the challenge process. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be like more active in a general sense, but just on the challenge side, I think that they might be a little bit less engaged than I had previously thought. But it is worth noting that ULFWs are reliant on CBRS access and to a lesser extent also on 6 gigahertz access. And so the possibility now under, this Senate Commerce text that was just passed into law, now that these bands stand as eligible for auction, the idea basically that we might be building these networks on top of sand, that we might be building these networks, ULFW, networks on top of bands that may be sold off in the coming years is, I think, a really concerning risk. And I mean, maybe those folks in those areas would be eligible for other technologies like Starlink or Kuiper, but it is really concerning that we may be building out networks that are kind of defunct within a year or two because of the auction. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. This year in the telecom space, I learned a new key phrase, which was the benefit of the bargain, which I had not previously known as a telecom term. The policy notice requires all states to participate in a benefit of the bargain round of sub-grantee competition within 90 days and to submit these results to NTIA. This was regardless of where the state was at in their sub-grantee selection process. NTIA stated that it will complete the review of these benefit of the bargain final proposals within 90 days of submission. As of Monday, this week, all 56 states and territories received approval to begin their benefit of the bargain round. I know we're not asking, NTIA to fly around the world in 80 days, but how much pressure has NTIA put themselves under to redirect this program in just 180 days? And kind of what are your reactions to the benefit of the bargain idea? And Stephanie, as someone coming from NTIA, I would love to go to you first here.
Sure. I mean, look, I think the timeline is challenging. I think it's challenging for everybody. I think it was challenging for the states to pivot, and in two different ways, right? Those states that had already kind of were at the finish line had, in some cases, final proposal approvals, having to kind of go back and redo. I think it's even in some ways more challenging for those states that had previously more than 90 days, because there was a year from the approval of their initial proposal, and all of a sudden that window got shortened. And I think it will be challenging for NTIA to move so quickly to evaluate and ideally approve these proposals. That said, right, I think it's look, I've been in agencies a number of times, and when the head of the agency says get it done, you get it done. So I think that if that's the direction, I believe that they'll get it done, and I think they'll do the job of making sure that they are, consistent with the statute, and the assistant secretary has everything she needs in order to make that decision to approve them. So challenging, but not impossible. But I'm going to acknowledge challenging. In terms of the benefit of the bargain, first of all, I think it's a contract law term. So it's an interesting term in this context, because it's really, about putting people in the position they would be at the end of the contract, which gets back to the, like, what are we trying to do here question. But more specifically to what, not just the term, but what it is. We've already talked about it a bit, and in some ways it's not entirely new, right? It's certainly simplified, but states, generally speaking, they had to run competitive grant programs, and cost was certainly a factor by which they were evaluating the grant applications. Clearly, I already mentioned that from my perspective, the big change here is there's just much less flexibility within the states, and much more constraints in terms of how those applications will be scored, which, it does. I know some have said that this makes the BEAD competitive grant process more like an auction, because it's kind of a single application and really a focus on costs, which gets me back to, okay, but then let's make sure we actually get the performance we're looking for, whatever it ends up. And I will note that while that is all very constrained in terms of the benefit of the bargain round, the first thing states need to do, as I think Nat and others have mentioned, is sort of identify, because of the statute, right? Section 1702H still says you must prioritize priority broadband projects. So that still sits on top of the minimal BEAD cost outlay and the scoring criteria that's been specified in the benefit of the bargain round. So, we'll see what happens, but it is a place where you could take into account some of those network performance criteria that I think it's important to try to consider now on a very project-specific basis, maybe a good thing, and on a very state-specific basis also may be a good thing, to the extent it could differ for different states and within the state on different projects. But last point, it still allows for this kind of negotiation round, which is something you don't get in an auction, where the new notice does allow for locations, providers to separate out locations from the project area that was defined. And so that part was always harder to figure out what the outcome would be, because there are really these individualized negotiations among providers, and I think we'll see more of that. So the actual outcome is still pretty uncertain from my perspective.
I know we're trying to get through this really quickly, but I do have one really quick comment, and then no, we got to keep it
We're
moving.
doing great on time. We're doing awesome.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, to everything Stephanie said, I also just wanted to say one other thing about on the waiver front. One of the problems with it, beyond the timeline, yes, it's very tight administratively, but I've heard a lot from state broadband offices about like some inconsistent and unclear guidance on the waiver side. I heard from one state broadband office that said that there's not much public guidance about what waivers are likely to be granted. They also shared with me that there were several state officials who said that they only learned about which waivers were offered or approved by word of mouth from their peers. Like it wasn't even posted anywhere on a website. So that kind of like opaque discretionary process around waivers, I think it not only creates delays, but it also creates some distrust that the process is being conducted fairly across all states. So, I mean, it's great that NTIA is going to some states and saying, don't worry, you have a lot of flexibility on certain things. Like we're not going to penalize you for certain things, but it would be nice to see that done in a really transparent and consistent way across every state. So that's just one note.
Yeah, I might answer your original question. Look, I think that NTA now has an administrator. She's incredibly capable. Ariel Roth will do a wonderful job, and she knows what she's walking into. And the administration knows when they created this new policy guidelines, what the deadlines that they're putting on themselves. So I think they're very capable of meeting them. Yes, it's challenging, but I think that they can certainly, power through this with the goal of expediting. They certainly don't want to take too long, given the critique of the last administration. So they're balancing that, and I think that they can successfully plow through applications as they come in, and we can get to finally actually getting some building done.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think I agree with Stephanie that we need to make sure that these bids are enforceable. I think one of the biggest changes in the benefit of the bargain round is also that probably more companies will be participating this time, because I think in the previous program there was both a real structural bias, but also a perception that if you're not a fiber and fiber ISP, then you don't really have a chance. So I think that more competition for those funds will be good. And I also agree that better guidance from NTIA all the way down the line would be good, especially as it comes to non-deployment funds.
All right, here in the last, well, first I want to say if there's anyone who has questions, please make sure to put them in the Q&A. I've got the chat panel up and just looking at those. Kind of an open-ended question. Oh, don't want to go to that one yet. Let's talk about non-deployment funding. The policy notice states that funding for allowable non-deployment purposes is under review, and NTIA will be issuing updated guidance in the future. As of the date of today, as of the date of this policy notice, NTIA rescinds approval of all non-deployment activities approved in initial proposals. What do you think will be the impact of this non-deployment funding termination if it stays in place? And how do you think states are considering this right now as they do their subgrantee process? Joe, if you wouldn't mind, giving us a start.
Yeah. So I think the impact of it will be that we will not address the majority of the causes of the digital divide, that we end up with a program that very efficiently addresses 3% of the problem, and then we are back to the drawing board on the other 97%. I think this is a program that can close the digital divide if we prioritize and direct the money properly. So more guidance on that will be good. Also, I do think, though, that like the statute says that a permissible use of funds is for broadband adoption programs. And so I think there's room for states to say, this is an argument I'm stealing from Greg Geis of the Verdenberg Group, that the statute says, you can, the statute says you can use money for broadband adoption, state use the money for broadband adoption. I think that, we'll see how that works out legally. I think the cleanest way to do this is for NTIA to say, look, we are interested. It's NTIA's own data that says that affordability and lack of interest are the biggest causes of the digital divide. Let states, address those with the excess BEAD funds.
Yeah, and like these are not just like extraneous woke objectives that are kind of like BS stuff. Like this stuff is like workforce training, digital navigator programs, local technical assistance. This stuff like enables the investments that are made under BEAD. They help stretch the BEAD dollars farther. So yeah, I think it leaves states in a difficult place. Like they followed the rules and they did everything. They thought that they were set to get all this support for their programs, and then to have that pulled out from underneath them would leave them in a compromised position.
One other thing to add on that is I think that if you say you're taking back all the money, I think that's a recipe for waste, fraud, and abuse with the existing money. That you say this is only for deployment. I think there's going to be some deployments that are more expensive than they should have been, and money that goes places where it probably shouldn't. So yeah.
I don't know. I mean, if I looked at some of the applications that were, I call them pre-approved on the Biden administration, I think Louisiana had half of their money going to non-deployment purposes. And some of those were really creative. I'll use that word. And I think that's a problem. And I think this administration is like, no, we're going to take another look at this and really kind of, make sure that those funds, if we decide to go down some of those routes that Joe has talked about or otherwise, we're going to be very, very mindful of them rather than just have here's your money and it's a block grant, right? They're going to be, they're coming with strings. And I think that's understandable. I mean, we're not in a universe we were 4 years ago or 6 years ago when the statute was written or 4 years ago. So, I mean, it is a changed universe, and we have to understand that. If there's going to be an affordability program, well, then that's a policy call to make. It's just not a flexible, here's some money, good luck with it. And so I think that there's an understandable reason why they're saying we're going to hold this until we figure some of these things out.
All right, with our remaining 4 or 5 minutes here, let's turn a bit down the road. I'd like to think maybe 10 to 15 years after the BEAD deployment program kind of comes to a close and we're kind of sitting in this post-BEAD universe, and ask a pretty open-ended question. What does broadband funding and deployment look like after BEAD? What do you think this means for USF reform, or how USF should be reformed to kind of accomplish these goals? And should we kind of overall be done with rural broadband deployment subsidies if we've kind of efficiently closed the digital divide this way? And I think Commissioner O'Reilly, if you wouldn't mind going to start here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll ever wait 15 years for the ground to settle. It usually has a window of like 2 or 3 years, and probably not even that long. And so there'll be people that want to create, new programs and will want to use new funds. I do think that there's probably a percentage of people that that BEAD won't cover everybody, and there'll still be some unserved locations, and we'll have to address them, whether there's leftover money or however we deal with it. Some form is going to have to deal with them going forward. But USF has to be reformed, and it's not going to take over. In my mind, it's not going to be the OpEx for BEAD. It doesn't have the funding. It won't have the funding for that purpose. And so when I look down the road, there's probably a need for some additional improvements after BEAD if we ever get through BEAD. And will be, almost everybody in America will have access. And then we can fight over whether we should have an affordable program or not. I think we all agree there should be something, and we can debate over whether it should look like mine's probably more narrow than everyone else's, but so be it. But I think that's what we have some of the universe to fight over. And there's portions of USF. I mean, Lifeline, we can fight over whether that still makes any sense or how things should be structured, but the debates aren't going away overall. This is just going to shrink, incredibly shrink. BEAD's going to shrink the number of unserved households and probably to a really finite number, less than 1 million. I don't know where we're going to end up.
Yeah, I agree with, with some of that, is especially on the, yes, the most of the burdens from here on out on the broadband access side are going to be affordability related. And so this is going to shift the conversation more to the demand side, supports like a revised Lifeline that looks more like the ACP. BEAD is a very significant CapEx investment, but these networks will still need some durable systems of maintenance and support. So I think high cost programs that look a little bit more OpEx oriented and less focused on getting the programs built out and in the ground is one thing. And I'd be open to seeing like the high cost programs OpEx supports extended to other technologies like LEOs. Like I think, it would have to be reconfigured quite a bit because the program is designed for terrestrial providers. But if some providers are included, it makes sense to equalize that out to the rest of the playing field.
Yeah, I would say probably it should look like no more deployment subsidies, period. I think that we can say after decades and decades of every different government deployment program, BEAD being sort of the culmination of that, I think the biggest one we've seen yet, that any deployment problem that can be solved by government money has been after this. We'll also be in a world where the technologies that are able to serve high-cost areas actually profitably and economically will be matured. And there are a lot of political, interest for, OpEx to go on forever for, companies that can't serve rural areas economically. But once we have companies that can, I think those should go away as well. Ideally, also by this time, broadband, as Mike said earlier, broadband is one of the few things that's gotten cheaper over the years. And I think probably we'll see that continue, and that therefore we'll need less affordability support over time, but we will still have some. And ideally, that's this more targeted than ACP, something like Lifeline eligibility, but vouchers to people who really need it. And then also that all of these technologies have scaled so that everyone has more bandwidth to work with. We have these. I agree with you, Stephanie, that our bandwidth needs today are not going to be our bandwidth needs forever. But I think all of these technologies that we deploy are capable of scaling and getting into gigabit speeds, or whenever we invent the app that actually needs that.
I'll just jump in real quick as the last word. I am optimistic in terms of BEAD, even if it's new iteration, in actually achieving at least that connectivity piece. I don't think that means there's no longer a need for universal service for a lot of the reasons that have been addressed, in addition to the fact that universal service also encompasses support for schools, libraries, rural healthcare. It is a broader program than just the affordability deployment OpEx kind of that we've been talking about. But I guess, the piece in terms of what happens at the end, right? Because at least some of the funds may be used for construction, whether that's a fiber deployment or even a fixed wireless deployment, right? If other funds are used for the reservation of capacity, right? At the end of that, what are we left with? Like, what have we achieved in terms of kind of actual lasting, durable change, even on the deployment side? And that's what makes me a little kind of nervous, and waiting to see how the new restructured notice plays out in terms of technology mix and the ability of BEAD to achieve what I see as its objectives. Libby, I think you've come on to tell us it's time to go.
We're getting the handle here, pulling us off. Maybe we'll have to have a 10-year anniversary call, and we can re-listen to the podcast and see if our predictions were correct or not. So, who knows? Hopefully we're not BEAD 2 or BEAD 3 at that point. But I just want to thank our panelists for taking the time today to chat and have a really meaningful conversation about this program. I'm excited to see how NTIA does and to see how excited you all are in following it as it goes along. Libby, handing it back over to you.
Great, thank you. And absolutely not to cut anyone off. That was a great discussion. Thank you so much again to our speakers for joining us today and for sharing your wonderful insights. Thank you to Slate for moderating. And if you're interested in learning more about all of our programming here at the Federalist Society, please visit our website, as previously mentioned, at fedsoc.org, or feel free to send us your feedback. We always love to hear it at fedsocforums@fedsoc.org. Thank you.